Ananta, the endless city. Ethan's head throbbed as he opened his eyes to the harsh glow of a buzzing neon sign outside the window. The room was foreign cheap furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a faint odor of mildew. On the bedside table, his phone vibrated incessantly. He picked it up, squinting at the screen. Get home early and game on. The message was from an unknown number. Confused, he scrolled through his call logs, his heart sinking. They were blank. Photos, empty. It was as if his entire digital history had been wiped clean. Pulling back the curtain, Ethan looked outside. The city stretched endlessly, its skyline a jagged maze of buildings that seemed to lean unnaturally, as if watching him. The streets below were eerily quiet, devoid of the usual clamor of urban life. He caught sight of a man on the corner, standing unnaturally still, his head tilted upward as though sniffing the air. Something about the scene made Ethan's stomach churn. Ethan ventured into the street, the silence oppressive. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, like the city was amplifying them. The air felt thick, almost sentient, and the further he walked, the more the building seemed to change. Windows disappeared, doors shifted locations, and alleyways twisted impossibly. He stopped in front of a small diner, the neon sign flickering erratically. A middle-aged woman sat behind the counter, her eyes darting nervously as he entered. "You shouldn't be out here after dark," she muttered, without looking up. Ethan frowned. I woke up in a hotel room. I don't even know where I am." Her gaze snapped to him, her pupils narrowing like a cat's. "You're in Ananta." "Ananta?" he echoed. "Never heard of it. How do I leave?" The woman laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Nobody leaves. Not anymore." Before he could press her further, the lights in the diner flickered and a low hum reverberated through the air. The woman's expression turned to panic. "Go! Now!" Back on the street, Ethan's surroundings had changed again. The diner was gone, replaced by a crumbling apartment building. He looked down at his phone. The same message blinked on the screen. Get home early and game on. A shadow moved in the corner of his eye. He turned sharply, but nothing was there. His pulse quickened. As he walked, he became aware of the sound of footsteps mirroring his own. He stopped. The echo did not. A low voice hissed from behind him. "Welcome home." Ethan spun around, his breath catching. Standing in the middle of the street was a humanoid figure, its eyes glowing an unnatural green, its body coiled unnaturally like a serpent about to strike. Its face split into a grin far too wide for a human. Over the following days, if they could even be called days, Ethan encountered others. Lila, a disheveled young woman obsessed with unraveling the city's mysteries, had been there for what she estimated was months. She showed him maps she'd drawn of Ananta's shifting streets, though none stayed accurate for long. "The city is alive," she whispered. "It feeds on us." Ethan wanted to dismiss her as paranoid, but the evidence was undeniable. Streets looped back on themselves. Reflections in windows showed scenes that hadn't happened yet. A serpentine tattoo had appeared on his forearm, twisting and writhing as if alive. Lila led Ethan to a hidden subway entrance, whispering that the core of the city lay beneath. The descent was treacherous. The tunnels were suffocatingly narrow, the walls pulsating faintly like they were breathing. Strange whispers echoed around them, growing louder as they approached a massive, pulsating chamber. At the heart of Ananta lay the truth. A colossal serpent coiled around a monolithic structure of glass and stone, its scales shimmering with an otherworldly light. The serpent's eyes bore into Ethan's soul, and memories he didn't recognize flooded his mind. Endless iterations of himself waking in the hotel room, wandering the city, and succumbing to its horrors. "You are part of me," the serpent hissed. "You always have been." Ethan's knees buckled as he realized the truth. He was trapped in a cycle, reliving the same nightmare, his memories erased each time. The city's growth depended on their suffering, and there was no escape. Lila screamed as the ground swallowed her whole, leaving Ethan alone with the serpent. Desperate, he clawed at the pulsating core, determined to end the cycle, even if it meant destroying himself. Darkness consumed him. Ethan awoke to the buzzing of a neon sign. The hotel room was as he had left it, but the air felt different. He looked at his phone. Get home early and game on. Outside, a woman walked the streets, her movements hesitant and confused. Ethan watched as she stopped in front of the diner, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. In the distance, the serpent's shadow loomed over the city, its hiss echoing faintly in the air. The cycle began anew. Ananta. The Endless City, Part 2. Ethan stood frozen by the window of his hotel room, staring at the woman outside. Her face mirrored his own confusion and fear. She paused at the diner, glancing around nervously, clutching a journal tightly to her chest. Something about her was familiar, too familiar. His phone buzzed again. The same message appeared. Get home early and game on. He threw the phone across the room, but it landed unscathed. The screen continued to flash insistently, the message a taunt rather than an instruction. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for it again. He wasn't sure why he kept reading the words. Maybe a part of him thought they would change, offer something more, something meaningful. They won't, whispered a voice in his head. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, but the voice lingered, like the static hum of a forgotten radio station. The next morning, if time still followed a proper schedule, Ethan left the hotel room. The woman was gone, but her presence lingered in the air, a faint trace of warmth in the otherwise frigid city. He clutched a hastily scribbled map Lila had left behind before the city swallowed her. The lines and notes crisscrossed in chaotic patterns, but one word stood out, circled multiple times. Core. Ethan knew where he needed to go. The subway tunnels. The entrance to the subway was hidden in plain sight, tucked behind an old bookshop. The moment he descended the stairs, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, and each step echoed unnaturally. The walls were coated in a thin layer of moisture, glistening under the dim light of a single flickering bulb. He thought about the serpent's voice, the way it had whispered truths he couldn't fully comprehend. You are part of me. You always have been. What did it mean? Was he just another pawn in the city's endless game? Or was there a way to break free? The tunnels stretched endlessly before him, but his path was clear. The map Lila had drawn seemed to guide him instinctively, as though she had carved a part of herself into its lines. But the further he ventured, the more distorted the tunnels became. Walls shifted, narrowing and expanding like the ribcage of a breathing beast. Tracks bent impossibly, spiraling into the shadows. Ethan's heart pounded as he heard a low guttural sound behind him. He turned, flashlight shaking in his hand. A figure emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing faintly green. It wasn't human not anymore. The features were twisted, elongated, as though the city had reshaped it to suit its needs. Its mouth split open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Ethan ran. Hours, sir, perhaps mere minutes passed in a blur of panic and disorientation. When Ethan finally stopped, he was in a cavernous chamber. The walls shimmered like scales, and the ground pulsed faintly beneath his feet. In the center of the room stood a monolithic structure, a tangle of glass and stone that seemed to shift when he looked away. At its base, a figure knelt, their back turned to him. Lila? Ethan's voice cracked. The figure turned, and his stomach dropped. It was the woman from the street. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched the journal to her chest, as though it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Who are you? She whispered. Ethan, he said. I think I've seen you before. She shook her head, stepping back. No, you're part of it. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but a deafening hiss cut through the air. The ground trembled as a shadow fell over them. He turned to see Ananta's massive form coiling around the chamber. Its eyes glowed brighter than ever, pinning them both in place. Welcome back, it hissed, its voice reverberating through Ethan's very bones. The woman dropped her journal. Ethan's gaze flicked to it, and he saw the same looping message scrawled across the pages. Get home early and game on. Over and over, the words filled every inch of the paper, accompanied by crude drawings of the serpent and the city skyline. Beneath the chaos, however, there was a single line of text that stood out. Destroy the core. Ethan lunged for the journal, but the serpent struck. Its tail swept across the chamber, slamming him into the wall. Pain exploded through his body, but he managed to grab the book. The woman screamed as Ananta coiled around her, lifting her off the ground. You will never leave, the serpent hissed. Ethan flipped through the journal, his vision blurring. The instructions for the ritual were cryptic, written in fragmented sentences and symbols he didn't fully understand. He didn't have time to decipher it all. The serpent tightened its grip on the woman, her cries growing weaker. Stop, Ethan shouted. I'll do it. I'll stop the cycle. The serpent paused, its head swiveling toward him. Its eyes burned into his, and he felt his mind unraveling. Memories of past cycles flooded back, different versions of himself, of Lila, of others he didn't recognize. All of them had tried. All of them had failed. You cannot destroy me, Ananta whispered. You are me. Ethan's grip on the journal tightened. His voice was steady as he replied, Not this time. The chamber erupted in chaos as Ethan began the ritual. Words spilled from his lips, foreign yet familiar. The serpent thrashed, its body tearing through the walls. The woman fell to the ground, gasping for air. The city trembled around them, its labyrinthine streets collapsing in on themselves. Ananta lunged, its massive jaws snapping inches from Ethan's face. But he didn't falter. With a final word, he slammed the journal onto the core, its pages igniting in a brilliant blaze of light. The serpent let out an ear-splitting scream as its body began to unravel, scales disintegrating into ash. The chamber collapsed, and Ethan's vision went white. When he awoke, the city was gone. He stood in an open field, the sky bright and endless. The woman was beside him, staring in disbelief. Did we? She began, but her words trailed off. Ethan didn't answer. In the distance, a faint shadow loomed. The skyline of a new city was rising. His phone buzzed. Get home early and game on. Ananta. The Endless City, Part 3. Ethan stared at the message glowing on his phone. Get home early and game on. He wanted to throw the device into the field and leave it behind, but the words held a gravity he couldn't escape. Beside him, the woman Ava, as she introduced herself, rubbed her arms as if warding off a chill, though the air was warm. It's not over, Ava said quietly, her voice trembling. It never is. Ethan turned toward the horizon. The skyline of the new city rose faster than it should have, its skeletal buildings assembling themselves brick by brick. Glass windows shimmered into place, and roads carved their way into the earth, creating another labyrinth. The distant hum of construction filled the air, relentless and mechanical. We stopped it, Ethan said, though his words lacked conviction. We destroyed the core. Ava shook her head. We broke the cycle, but we didn't escape it. The city, it's still alive. It just moved. Hours passed as they walked toward the rising skyline. The field stretched on endlessly, but no matter how far they traveled, the city seemed to stay at the same distance. The sun never shifted from its position in the sky, hanging motionless like a cruel joke. Ethan's legs burned, his throat dry, but he didn't dare stop. Something, a memory, a whisper urged him forward. We need to find the others, Ava said suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan frowned. What others? Ava hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, as though expecting to see someone following them. I don't know. I feel like there's more of us. People like you, like me. People who've woken up in that place. And what? They'll help us stop this? Ethan's voice was sharper than he intended. Because last time we tried, the city just reset. What makes you think anything we do matters? Ava stopped walking, her eyes narrowing. If it didn't matter, why would the city fight so hard to keep us trapped? Ethan didn't have an answer. He turned away, resuming his march toward the city that never grew closer. As night fell, if it could be called night, the air grew colder. The field transformed subtly, the grass taking on a metallic sheen, and the hum of the distant city became a low, rhythmic pulse. Ethan and Ava stopped to rest, sitting back to back for warmth. "Do you remember anything?" Ava asked, her voice barely audible. "Before you woke up in the hotel?" Ethan shook his head. "Just fragments. Flashes of faces I think I knew. A life that doesn't feel like mine anymore." "Me too," Ava admitted. "It's like the city erases pieces of us every time it resets. How much longer until there's nothing left?" Ethan didn't respond. The thought terrified him more than anything else. When they woke, the city was closer. The buildings loomed impossibly tall, their glass surfaces reflecting a warped version of the landscape. As they approached the outskirts, Ethan noticed the streets were already populated. Figures moved through the city, their movements stiff and unnatural. They wore blank expressions, their eyes empty. "What are they?" Ava whispered. Ethan shook his head. "Not people. Not anymore." They slipped through the crowd, careful not to draw attention. The city felt alive around them, the air charged with energy. Streetlights buzzed faintly, their glow casting long, distorted shadows. The buildings seemed to shift when they weren't looking, doors and windows rearranging themselves. Ava stopped suddenly, pointing to a figure standing in the center of the street. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood. He held a piece of paper, staring at it intently. As they approached, he looked up, revealing hollow eyes that glowed faintly green. "You don't belong here," the man said, his voice a guttural rasp. Ethan's blood ran cold. "We're trying to leave." The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "There is no leaving. The city is everything. You are already part of it." Before they could respond, the man crumpled to the ground, his body dissolving into ash that was swept away by an invisible wind. Ava grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him away. "We need to move," she said. Now, they ducked into an alleyway, the walls closing in around them. The city seemed to sense their presence, its pulse growing louder. The shadows moved unnaturally, stretching toward them like grasping hands. At the end of the alley, they found a door. It was carved with the same symbols Ethan had seen in Lila's journal. Without hesitation, Ava pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit, filled with maps, notes, and photographs pinned to the walls. A man sat at a desk, scribbling furiously in a notebook. He looked up as they entered, his face gaunt but alive. His eyes widened in recognition. "You made it," he said, standing. "I've been waiting for you." Ethan exchanged a confused glance with Ava. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "I'm like you, a survivor, and I know how to end this. For good." The man who introduced himself as Caleb explained the city's true nature. Ananta wasn't just alive, it was growing, feeding on their fear and despair. Every cycle strengthened it. Every failed attempt to escape deepened its roots. "But there's a way to starve it," Caleb said, spreading out a map on the desk. "The city thrives on cycles, on repetition. If we break the pattern, even for a moment, it will weaken." "How do we do that?" Ava asked. Caleb hesitated, his expression grim. "Someone has to reach the core and stay there. No resets, no escapes. The city has to be confronted directly, or it will consume us all." Ethan felt a weight settle in his chest. "And what happens to the person who stays?" Caleb didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. As the city's pulse grew louder, the three of them prepared for their final descent. The streets outside twisted and shifted, the city's defenses rallying against them. The figures in the crowd turned their glowing eyes toward the trio, their movements growing faster and more aggressive. "This is it," Caleb said, gripping a rusted crowbar. "One way or another, we end this." Ethan glanced at Ava. Her face was pale, but her eyes were determined. They stepped out into the chaos, the city's shadows closing in around them. Ananta. The Endless City, Part 4. The streets twisted into a chaotic maze as Ethan, Ava, and Caleb moved forward. The city's defenses manifested in eerie ways. Walls reshaped themselves to block their path, glowing-eyed figures multiplied, and whispers echoed from unseen places. We're running out of time, Caleb shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing hum of the city. Ava gritted her teeth and pointed toward a flickering subway entrance up ahead. There! That's where we go! Ethan hesitated, his legs faltering as the crowd of glowing-eyed figures advanced. They weren't running, they didn't have to. Their sheer number and the relentless pressure of the city's presence were enough to make the air feel oppressive. Go! Caleb roared, shoving Ethan forward. The subway entrance yawned like the mouth of some great beast. The flickering lights inside cast long, jagged shadows on the cracked tile walls. Ava descended first, her breaths sharp and rapid. Caleb followed, gripping his crowbar tightly, and Ethan brought up the rear, glancing nervously over his shoulder. As soon as they reached the platform, the stairs behind them collapsed into rubble. The city wasn't just blocking their retreat, it was hurting them forward. The core is below us, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the tension in his expression. We need to take the maintenance tunnels. Ava shone her flashlight down a narrow passage at the end of the platform. The beam revealed rusted tracks and an unsettling smear of something dark and wet along the walls. It's like the city's bleeding, she murmured. Ethan didn't reply. He couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were breathing, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the city's pulse. The maintenance tunnels were worse than Ethan imagined. The air was thick and foul, and the floor was slick with some unknown substance. The city's whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Stay focused, Caleb said, his voice cutting through the noise. It's trying to get inside your head. Ava nodded, though her eyes darted nervously to the shadows shifting at the edges of the tunnel. How much farther? Not far, Caleb replied. But it's going to get worse before it gets better. As if on cue, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the tunnel, and the walls began to close in, narrowing the passage. Run! Caleb shouted. The trio sprinted through the collapsing tunnel, the city's growl transforming into a deafening roar. Ethan's heart pounded as he dodged falling debris, his lungs burning with every ragged breath. Just as the walls seemed ready to crush them, they burst into a cavernous space. The chamber was massive, its walls lined with pulsating veins of light that seemed to feed into a central structure. At the heart of the room stood the Coria, towering, serpentine mass of stone and glass, coiled around itself like a living organism. It radiated a cold, otherworldly energy that made Ethan's skin crawl. That's it, Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. The core. Ava stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the massive structure. How do we destroy it? Caleb hesitated, his grip tightening on the crowbar. Someone has to stay here, to hold the city's attention while the others destroy it. It won't let us all go. That's not an answer, Ava snapped. How do we destroy it? Before Caleb could respond, the walls of the chamber began to ripple. Shadows poured from the cracks, coalescing into monstrous forms. The city wasn't going to let them get close to the core without a fight. We don't have time for this, Ethan shouted, grabbing a rusted pipe from the ground. We'll figure it out as we go. The battle was chaotic. The shadowy figures moved with unnatural speed, their forms shifting and warping as they attacked. Caleb swung his crowbar with brutal efficiency, while Ava used a knife she'd concealed in her boot. Ethan fought clumsily but desperately, his makeshift weapon connecting with enough force to send the shadows recoiling. For every shadow they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. The room grew colder, and the light from the veins in the walls began to flicker. We can't keep this up, Ava shouted, blood streaming from a gash on her arm. Get to the core, Caleb yelled. I'll hold them off. No, Ethan protested. We're not leaving you. You don't have a choice, Caleb roared, shoving Ethan toward the core. Go, now. Ethan hesitated, torn between helping Caleb and following Ava, who was already making her way toward the core. Finally, he turned and ran, his heart heavy with guilt. The core loomed above them, its surface shimmering with an unearthly light. Ava reached it first, pressing her hands against the cold, glass-like surface. It's alive, she said, her voice filled with awe and terror. Ethan joined her, staring up at the massive structure. "What do we do?" Ava closed her eyes, her brow furrowing in concentration. "We break the cycle. We stop it from resetting." Somehow, the core pulsed violently, sending a shockwave through the chamber. Ava was thrown back, hitting the ground hard. Ethan caught himself against the core, his hands burning where they touched its surface. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The city spoke directly to him, its voice 1,000 overlapping tones. "You cannot win. You are mine." Ethan gritted his teeth, fighting against the overwhelming pressure in his mind. He looked back at Ava, who was struggling to her feet, her face pale but determined. "We end this," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Together." Ava nodded, stepping up beside him. They placed their hands on the core, the whispers growing to a deafening roar as they focused all their will on breaking the cycle. The chamber erupted in light, the core's pulsing veins shattering one by one. The shadowy figures dissolved into nothing, their forms unraveling like smoke. The city's hum faded, replaced by an eerie silence. As the core crumbled, Ethan and Ava felt the ground shift beneath them. The chamber began to collapse, the walls caving in. "We need to go," Ava shouted. Ethan hesitated, glancing back at the rubble where Caleb had been. There was no sign of him. Swallowing his grief, he turned and ran with Ava, the two of them narrowly escaping as the chamber fell in on itself. They emerged into daylight, the field stretching out before them. The skyline of the city was gone, replaced by a blank horizon. For the first time, the air felt still. Ava collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Ethan sat beside her, his body trembling with exhaustion. "Did we do it?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked out at the empty horizon, his heart heavy. "I don't know." In the distance, a faint hum began to rise. The two of them turned, their blood running cold as they saw a new skyline beginning to form. The city wasn't finished with them yet.